hydrologic cycle. So as rain falls, it moves through the watershed, but that watershed is typically blanketed with forest. And so water is moving essentially through forest. And the pure water that we depend on, the good quality water we depend on, is a product of forest filtration, bottom line. Strip out the forest, you have problems. But the global hydrologic cycle is the terrestrial landscape is very important in that whole process. Of course, let me get to the next slide here. A watershed, just look at the different components of a watershed as we're talking here. A watershed is a very three-dimensional system. It's got that river network, of course, that we're all familiar with, wherever all the water eventually flows into and then out to sea. But it also includes all the land that drains into that network. And in the dry season, that's just a very small amount of land, but in the wet season, it can go all the way up to the edges of the catchment basin, that geographical bowl in the real estate carved by flowing water over eons of time. It also includes the groundwater. And there are a lot of recharge zones in every aquifer, in every watershed that's recharging aquifers. And we don't really know a lot about our groundwater provinces in Belize. We have ideas, but we realize that there may be many watersheds that are feeding into one groundwater reservoir, but we're still unclear as to all that. But we need to know that kind of information for future management, so we're actually making decisions flying blind right now. It also includes the forest associated with this landscape, and again, the forest being very premium to what we're going to be talking about. Wildlife of all kinds, and also people and all the things we do out there, roads and houses and agriculture and manufacturing and everything else we do. All of those are the ingredients of a watershed. And when you're managing a watershed, all of those ingredients have to be dealt with. A real quick functional definition of a watershed, because a watershed is providing incredible ecological services that we can't do without. We can't duplicate those services. The only way we can maintain those services is helping to maintain the health of the watershed. So a watershed is basically a collection, storage, processing, meaning it's changing things, transport and distribution system for, of course, water, which is the medium for everything, but also sediments, dissolved minerals, nutrients, detritus, dissolved organic matter, living organisms, and energy. Lots of energy coming down the watershed. That connects the land and the sea, and that connection is also extremely important, particularly here in Belize, when our marine environment means so much. Watersheds build coastal zones. Coastal zones are extremely wealthy in resources. Probably about 90 to 95% of the fish protein that people eat come from coastal zones. Coastal zones only make up about maybe 10% of the marine surface area in the world, but it provides an incredible amount of marine protein. And the reason watersheds, the reason that coastal zones are so rich is because watersheds are constantly feeding them with all these nutrients that they're constantly delivering, and also the sediments that are coming out of the mountains into the sea sculptures the structure of the coastal zone. And here you're seeing all these watersheds here that are feeding into our Mesoamerican barrier reef. And this is some of the old, there it is, the old ICRAM MAR project, where they were doing some hydrologic modeling. And here we see the darkest ones are those watersheds that have been basically peeled. In this case, this is northern Honduras here, bananas. And if you fly over that, you're going to see brown rivers, no trees anywhere except bananas sticking up everywhere. And all of that is going, all that sediment is going right out to the sea. And if you follow that through, here's some of the little bit less problematic ones. Here we are kind of intermediate with Rio Hondo and Belize being some of the watersheds in Belize that provide a significant amount of sediments. But of course these watersheds also have something else in common. They're very important agricultural watersheds. But a healthy natural watershed is basically blanketed with forest. And of course that forest cover is what's so important for maintaining quality water. As the raindrops hit the canopy, they're already changing chemically. And as those raindrops drip through the canopy and in heavy rains, they're flowing down the trunks of trees, and they're encountering the soil. But when they get into the soil, they soak into the soil, they're still influenced by the trees, because the roots of the trees are reaching so deep. The roots of the trees are feeding that soil. The roots of the trees are creating a lot of the living organism communities that are in that soil, the fungus, bacteria, and other things that are giving that soil its living qualities. And the water's moving through this essentially living filter and changing as it's moving down slope. So really, forests are microbial filters through which the water is flowing on its path to the sea. And again, changing all the way. But that's what gives water quality. And what we think of as quality is water that's drinkable, water that's usable on our crops, water that doesn't have contaminants in it of one kind or another. And the watersheds are doing that for us, unless we disrupt what watersheds are, the functions of watersheds. And now here is the reason that we really need watershed management is because of agriculture. Agriculture puts a lot of stress on our watershed resources. And when we think in terms of watershed management, really watershed management is forestry management, it's waste management, and it's best practice agriculture. Put those three components together and you got good watershed management. What we're looking at right here is the Boles River Valley, and you can see from a Google Earth shot, you can pull this up on your own computer, you can see how that watershed valley there is completely different than where it was many years ago. As a matter of fact, a lot of this change has occurred in the past 20 years. I've seen tremendous change occurring in Belize, and it's increasing. And as it increases, the problem is we're stripping out some of the most important components of the watershed, particularly forest types that are doing some incredible services for us. And we've got to change the way we do business, bottom line. Forest and watersheds are also affect the quantity of water that's coming down the chute. Trees are evapotranspiring lots of water. They're like water pumps. Each tree, depending on the climatic conditions, might be pulling out 100 gallons of water from the soil and back into the atmosphere. In a forest, you can calculate how much evapotranspiration is occurring. They're also retaining water on the landscape. Water isn't just flowing off the landscape and into the rivers and streams and out to sea. It's being retained longer on the landscape. It's moving slower through the canopy. It's moving slower through the vegetated forest floor, and that keeps the water on the landscape longer so that we get more benefit. But if you strip the forest, what you've got is now a lot more flow coming through the watershed than the watershed is accustomed to. And when you increase the flow of the watershed's been designed by its average flow conditions. The shape of the river basins, the shape of the floodplain, all of these things are factors of the typical flood behavior of that particular watershed relative to the geology and soil types. You change anything about the river, about the flow patterns of a river, that watershed, the structure of that watershed has to change. You get far more erosion if you increase the water, because that system has to now carry a lot more water, so it needs to be designed differently, deeper and wider, and so you begin to increase erosion rates, losing topsoil, and you see lots of river braidings. When the rivers are carrying so much sediment they can no longer support that, they drop that sediment in flat areas, and then they diversify their main channels, and so they get this real braided kind of pattern. Also, rivers become shallower because they're carrying so much sediment that it settles into the bottom of the slower areas of the river, but then that means that the river starts to spread out more and widen, especially in flood events. So what happens is floods tend to reach further upslope as rivers become shallower. An example with the Boles River, it's a regulated river. And that means it no longer has these extreme high flows and such that it did in the past, which were flushing flows. Now they're more mediated because it's a dam. It's only on one main tributary, not two, but they're still strategizing about building dams on the whole pond. But by suppressing those large floods, we're seeing a lot of silts build up in the lower end of the river. So the river's actually beginning to shallow out a bit. And that's going to be heavier floods in the future. And of course, if you talk to the climate change folks, they're predicting a drier environment, but more punctuated rainfall, which means more floods. So we can expect to see actually more flood damage. There are several kinds of forest types that occur within the forest structure of a watershed, and that's kind of where I want to focus. Steep slope forests are obviously those are up in the hills. Very poor for most agricultural activities, typically thinner soils, and except for the poor people in Guatemala and other places that get pushed to the hills, most people don't prefer to try to do agriculture in the steep slope areas, but that's good. Otherwise, you get tremendous kinds of erosion happening. I remember, for example, when Hurricane Mitch came right up to the front door of Belize in, what was it, 1998. And then it swung around and sat on top of Honduras for a little while. And folks there had a habit of clearing all their hills and growing corn. But then I think about 6,000 people were buried. So, you know. The riparian forest, that's a very special kind of forest. That's the forest that's growing right along the riverbanks. And at the very edge of that forest, you've got these special kinds of trees that can tolerate the energy of flowing water. As you move upslope, you get a larger diversity of trees. Some of those trees you might find in more areas away from the river. But that forest area along the river is extremely controlling floods. It mediates, it dissipates flood energy. When flood waters are moving along a riparian forest that's still intact, you can see that flood energy just being dissipated by the turbulence of the water. Strip that away, and you've got raging floods coming through that are doing far more damage. They're also picking up a lot more sediment, which makes that water more dense and more destructive. So the riparian forests are one of our frontline defenses against flood damage. And in an age of adaptation to climate change, these are kind of things that we need to consider. Another very important type of forest are the wetland forests. Sometimes wetlands are also herbaceous. Wetlands are very important for a number of reasons. Oftentimes they are groundwater recharge zones. And without those wetlands to absorb and hold floodwaters, rather than all those floodwaters rushing down the river at once, they mediate the floods downstream. If, for example, Crooked Tree wetland system wasn't where it is today, you probably would have far less area in Belize City. All those lower areas of Belize City wouldn't exist. So it's important to keep these wetlands in the landscape because not only do they recharge aquifers, but they are also sinks for nutrients, for carbon. A lot of these are carbon sequestering, which is another thing that we need to consider. And also they're very important for maintaining biodiversity. So they're not agricultural areas, and I see farmers clearing these all the time, especially the smaller wetlands. And that's what's disappearing from the landscape are the smaller wetlands. Why do farmers clear wetlands? You fly over, you look down at the fields, you're not going to see any crops growing there. The soil is still saturated even though the vegetation is gone. The reason they usually clear wetlands is so they can plow in straight lines. They don't have to turn around the wetland. So it's more of a convenience than anything else. But it's the farmer not really fully understanding the importance of the wetland to the whole agricultural system because it's all about water management. And a farmer, whether they know it or not, is a water manager, especially if they dip their pipe into the river and start irrigating. They have to be water managers. So just looking at this little schematic here, the steep slope forests, here these valley floor forests. This is one that's been converted to an orchard. Here's one that's in more natural conditions. But then right here, this is the fill bank side of the river coming out of the screen at you. And so you got these riparian forests on each side that are lining the river, and then typically behind these riparian forests in the lower areas is where you typically find the wetlands. And so that's how the typical landscape sort of lays out. Functions of riparian forests, and they have a lot of functions. I highlighted the ones in red that are particularly important to the farmers, but all of these are actually important to the farmers in one way or another. They're very important in helping to stabilize river and stream banks. And I'll show you some examples here in a bit. And they are definitely important in slowing down that fast flow. Let me try to get my thing going here. Right here you can see the floodwaters moving through this inundated forest, and you can see all that energy churning there. And that's dissipated energy that's no longer the force energy of a flood that's going to be carving away riverbanks. Riparian forests also are extremely important in feeding the rivers and streams. The fruits and flowers, leaves and limbs that fall out of these riparian forests, that's the base food for organisms in the system. Bacteria, fungi, and all kinds of things grow on these leaves and start breaking them down. And then all kinds of little insect larvae and other things are eating those leaves and digesting those bacteria and fungi, what we call biofilm. And then of course the insects are feeding the fish, and the fish eventually feeding the people. So that's a very important process. So rivers and streams are eating this dead organic material, detritus. So they're really detritus processing systems. And not only that, but that's what ultimately goes out into the marine environment and makes the marine environment so rich. All of those organic materials that can't be absorbed by the organisms living in the streams. Riparian forests shade the water, which is very important too, because that gives organisms out there, fish and other mobile things, options. Sometimes the water gets really hot out there on dry season days, and fish have a way of finding shade and allowing their metabolism to slow down. And so that shade is very important. You strip out the forest and you actually reduce the diversity of habitat that's available. You reduce the diversity of habitat that's available, you reduce the biodiversity of the system. Another thing they do is add a lot of wood to the system. And wood is a very important habitat. To put on your mask and snorkel and go look for the fish in the river, you want to snorkel around the snags. This is where the fish like to hang out, because there's lots of things there to eat. All kinds of organisms are growing on the surface of that submerged wood. Also, the wood itself is also dissipating energy as water's flowing past. It's helping to break up that energy flow, and it's also stabilizing the riverbed, so the riverbed is not constantly eroding away. So wood is good. Oftentimes you see people want to improve their streams by stripping out the wood, which is not the thing to do. They also provide very important habitat for terrestrial species. And the riparian forests are the forest within the agricultural landscape that's always under production, because they always have water. In the dry season, a lot of things aren't in fruit. Wildlife have a problem, but there's always riparian forests to find something to eat. And consequently, these riparian forests are also very important wildlife corridors. They connect large areas of forest from one to the other and allow wildlife movement to happen. They're oftentimes the largest forests in an undisturbed landscape. Therefore, they're called the gallery forests, because they always have water. They're always in a growth mode. Other trees have to slow down during the dry season. Here's some examples of what happens when we particularly strip trees away from the cut bank side. As the river is making its bend, it's that cut bank where that energy is really the most intense. And water tends to move around those bends in kind of a spiraling motion, so that's a very aggressive eroding process going on there. So you can see the collapse of the banks here on those bendways. Here's where one has collapsed so far inland, it's threatening this road here. And this one right here was from a milpa farmer. And when I first saw the milpa farmer, the bed was out here, the riverbank was out here. And within about 4 years, it's migrated that far inland. I have a buddy of mine who has a tourist resort, and they made the mistake, as most people do, they have these tourist resorts, they want to clear the bush so they can see the river. And last year, he invested $500,000 to fortify the bank because it was undermining his hotel and cabins and swimming pool and all kinds of things. $500,000, and he hopes that works. He hopes that stabilizes the situation long enough to get some trees back in place, because really it's only the trees that's going to do. You put cement out there, that's going to break down. The trees are what really are designed to arrest that problem like that. Another impact that we have is cattle. And cattle right on the riverbank, compacting the soil, eating the small trees coming up, and nutrifying the water. They're dropping lots of fecal material into the water. Other kinds of things we're doing, mining rivers. When we start mining rivers, we start creating a head-cutting pattern that it erodes upstream, and the river starts to widen out, undercutting some of the banks, and you see bank collapse going on wherever there's heavy gravel mining. And of course, habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, all these other things that are going on. Cattle, corn, bananas, citrus, cane. In the Boles River watershed, cane is becoming the new thing. It's spreading everywhere. People are abandoning corn and beans and going into cane. Mennonite farmers, everybody. At least within the radius of the Santander sugar mill. Also, villages, towns, cities, tourist facilities all along the river contribute their components too. A lot of heavy sedimentation coming out, particularly in construction sites. That sewage buildup, where does that go? How effective is your system? That discharges into the river eventually. And of course, pesticides and hydrocarbons and solid waste, all of these different things that end up in the water. And when the riparian forest is stripped away, another very important thing it does is it is the filter system for the landscape. So when you strip away the riparian forest, you strip away that filter system, so everything goes to the water. Nutrients, pesticides, along with all the sediments. As long as that root soil matrix is in place within as long as that root soil matrix is in place on the riverbank, there's all those microbes that are living associated with the roots and all the extrudants that the roots are feeding the soil with, all the dead cells. And those, again, are microbial filters. You pass water laced with pesticides through there. That water's going to move through that very slowly, and it's going to give time for bacterial breakdown of pesticides. So by the time the byproducts of that reach the river, they're not toxic, or at least not as toxic. The same thing with nutrients. Nutrients get taken up rather than nutrifying the river. So very important biological filtration, physical filtration system. And riparian forest, or riparian deforestation, comes with a high cost oftentimes. Sometimes we see it, sometimes we don't. One prime example occurred with Kendall Bridge. You guys remember Kendall Bridge in 2008? They call it the bridge that spans the Kendall River, but that's not the Kendall River, that's the City River. Tropical storm Arthur was a 90-meter long bridge, steel, concrete, came down. Here's the flood over here. You can see how spread out the floodwaters are. There's where the bridge was the day before. And it took $12 million to replace that bridge, and it took quite a few years. So if you add up all the economic loss while that bridge was still being built, whenever the waters were high, there was no more transport to the south. The south was definitely cut off from the north. It took a few years, and during that time there was a lot of economic loss, but there was also some loss of lives. People died crossing the river, trying to get to work when the low water bridge was under. So if you really think about it, that $12 million to replace that bridge, and plus all the other economic loss, now we can actually put a value on the riparian forest upstream, because that bridge came down because a big farmer decided that he was going to grow pineapples along the riverside. So cleared all of the riparian forest, and the bush was stacked to the side there. And then along comes the flood, and the flood is picking up all this loose sediment, but it also is picking up these large pieces of trees, and it stacks everything against the bridge. And that water laden with heavy sediment is heavy water. And the force of that flood, with nothing to dissipate it, took the bridge right out. And the most amazing thing I saw was a minister stand in front of the TV cameras and explain that to the people of Belize, rather than denying it. I think it helped that I sent him a detailed letter a few days before that. But he stood in front of the camera and he explained that. No one ever mentioned the name of the farmer, although we know who he is. And the farmer never received any kind of problems from any of that. But that's what it cost to undo the damage done. And I don't think he got any pineapples either out of the deal. So it was kind of lost all the way around. And as I mentioned, riparian forests are these filter systems. I think I kind of hammered that to death. But here is just kind of give you a visual image of what's going on under the ground. Here's a variety of different thin buffer situations versus a thick buffer. I like this shot up here because it does show a little bit more of a contrast. Here's a farm where the farm has gone right up to the edge. They did leave the first row of trees, or at least a few trees here. Most of this is spiny bamboo right there. So they probably took out most of those trees. And when you see spiny bamboo, what you're looking at is probably a riparian edge that's in early succession. So spiny bamboo is one of the first things that comes back. And spiny bamboo is great because it can get in there and anchor to the bank and hold its own, and it dissipates floodwaters. It doesn't get ripped up with the force of flood. And it does take a few years, but if you watch the succession, you begin to see seedlings move through and get up into the canopy and start developing a forest structure again. But just by comparison, you can look right across the river here, and you can see what a well-developed riparian forest would look like. So if the farmer were smart, he would leave at least, I think the law says 66 feet, but that's kind of a legal definition. That was actually a law that goes back to about 1935, when people were using the river as a highway, and that gave people traveling the river a place to gather firewood and camp wherever they happen to be. But it also forms kind of a handy first start for a riparian law. But 66 feet is not really wide enough to do all the functions that a riparian forest would need. I would say a minimum of 100 feet. But then the deal is you can't really prescribe a single measurement for a whole watershed, because everything changes from upstream to down. But when you're up in the headwaters, a few feet might be enough. But when you're down in the lower reaches of the river, you may need 500 feet before you really see the effects. So it has to be a case-by-case situation. It has to be something defined with some ecological components to it. Another thing too is, well, here's another area. This one is really thin here. And you begin to see some bank failure right in here. But this is the next issue right here. This is a wetland area, and what they've done is completely cleared the wetland. The wetland is still there. It's still somewhat functioning as a wetland. It's still loaded with aquatic plants, so there is at least some things happening there. But clearing away the trees for agriculture and planting your crops close to that wetland, what you're doing is just ensuring you're going to be contaminating that wetland with pesticides. And essentially that's what's going on there. So here we are with a situation in Boles River system, and Boles River watershed is of national importance. Everybody Every tourist that comes to this country, every tourist, every Belizean drinks from the Belize River watershed. There's half the population living there, but then the rest of us are drinking Bellicans, Coca-Colas, bottled water, and rum, and all these things that come right out of this watershed. And this is a breadbasket for Belize. This is the food that's raised in this watershed winds up on the tables of Belizeans. There are more and more now export corporate farms that are selling sugar to Spain and other things like that. But for the most part, the food that was raised here wound up in the market. And right now there's still a lot of farmers that are supplying the local markets from this watershed. So it's a very important watershed, and we begin to see the deterioration to such an extent that now, this year, in the last 5 months, there's been a handful of projects, of rather big projects, that are coming online. I'm working on 3 of these. Projects are trying to identify where they need to spend the money to arrest the impact and slowly begin to reverse it. And of course, doing this without disrupting agriculture. And so that's a very challenging process here. I just want to run through some of these. Here's the, there we go. A rapid assessment of the system. I had actually been involved in floating this system. I didn't go into the Guatemala side. I've done that in the past, but my team floated this river from the border to the sea, and we also floated the lower end of the Macaw. We were mapping human impacts, the GPS, right bank, left bank, and mapping the shape of the riparian forest. And we also mapped every bank failure we saw, right bank, left bank, and the width of that, the length of that bank failure. Bank failures are sort of like the large-scale indicator of what's going on. We want to see bank failures. We want to see less and less bank failures, which would be an indication that we're doing a good job of recovery. So that's kind of an indicator that we're thinking about using there. So that job was done, and the next thing that happened is with the WWF and UB, we developed a draft Belize River Watershed Management Plan. That's just a draft. That's nothing. All it is a document that's laid out with all the ingredients that you would expect to see in a management plan addressing a specific watershed. But a management plan doesn't exist until the stakeholders come together and approve the management plan, or at least enough spokespeople from all the different groups of the watershed to actually have consensus as to, I mean, everybody's not going to get everything they want. It's a give and take kind of thing going on here. But we all need to chime in. We all need to represent ourselves. We all need to make sure that what we need and what we use out of the watershed is protected. We may be using it in the wrong way, and there may be a better way of doing that. And we're all willing to learn new ways and adopt new ways as adaptation. Because that's our challenge right now with this climate change. We have 2 choices. We adapt, or we go extinct. So I choose adaptation. So we got this management plan. It's just a draft, and it needs to be reviewed, and it needs to be reviewed by a lot of people. And that's a plan that's going to go forward. We're going to be doing a lot of consultation time. Then the Japanese Caribbean climate change program linked up with the UNDP, and we are in the process of developing the background work to create a water master plan. And that's a little bit different from the management plan, because the water master plan is focusing specifically on water, quantity, quality, what's coming through there, and how we maintain that. And also, we have to establish minimum flow standards. Rivers have to have a certain amount of water to function. And if we draw that down too much beyond that level, we kill out the river. And that's the last thing we want, because the river provides the water we need. So we're trying to develop a water master plan, but that also includes the groundwater. So you can begin to see how complicated that is. There's going to be a lot of research coming down the pipe to really fill in the gaps. Another very interesting player in this whole thing is Coca-Cola International. they're coming online with money to invest in helping to revive the watershed. Why? Well, the Belize River supplies Bowen and Bowen, which is their folks on the ground here pumping out Coca-Colas. And they're investing in these kind of scenarios all over the world. Wherever their plant is being fed by a watershed, they want to make sure that watershed at least stays in functional quality. So they're willing to put some money into that. So they're anteing up here in Belize. Some of the initiatives, these aren't all up, but this is what's happening. We're seeing this great increase in deforestation. We also have to remember this is a transboundary watershed, so we've got to enlist the aid of the Guatemalans at some point. We've got to cross the border and talk about watershed ecology with these guys, watershed management. They have to be part of the management plan. That's tricky, especially given the climate that we're in right now. But just to give a little bit more history there, I think it was around maybe 2003, 4, and 5, somewhere around in there. A delegation of Guatemalan NGOs and one of their government agencies crossed our border to visit with the NGOs and government agencies on our side that were interested in maintaining the quality of the watershed. They're upstream of us, but they were concerned enough to come over and initiate the conversation. And so that allowed a little bit of collaboration to go on, but then things kind of fizzled out. We need to refuel that process and get back on the task of developing a collaborative management plan that includes both sides. This is, again, it's the backbone of agriculture in this system, and more people, because of the climate change issues, the unpredictable rainfall, farmers are dropping those pipes into the river and taking water out to irrigate their fields. Every time I float the Belize River, I see new pumps. Every time, more and more. Nobody regulates that. Nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows how much water is being pulled out of the system. But there's so many downstream users. The Belize Water Service, for example, that's providing water to over half the population, for example. Bowen and Bowen and all these other industries that are associated with this watershed all have to have a piece. And so the farmers have to share. I know the farmers get desperate, but at the same time we have a limited amount of resources, so we need to start managing it collectively so that we all know what's going on. So anyway, I put this in yellow at the bottom because farmers and other key stakeholders, but certainly farmers in particular, need to get involved in planning and implementation of these plans. We've got to get the farmers to the table. Some of them have come to the table, but when I say come to the table, we got to have that table set up in Spanish. Look out, where farmers live. We got to go where farmers are. Farmers can't come to the meetings. They're busy people. And we also have to plan these meetings when they're not plowing, planting, and harvesting. We gotta factor into their time frame. But we've got to get farmer involvement because we can't go forward without farmer input. Otherwise, we're dead in the water, and we all lose because the system will just continue to deteriorate if we don't develop that situation. And is this where we're going? This is across the border. This is Guatemala. This is the Mopan River, and you can see right here, there's a tree there, a couple of trees there, there's a couple of trees there, a little patch right there. That's it, all the way to the bone. So that system is in crisis, and it's coming our way. Everything that comes into that system is eventually coming into Belize. There was plans of putting a dam there, but there must be almost 100 villages scattered throughout that whole Batin area, 70, 80, 100 villages. And if they put a dam just about anywhere, they would inundate those villages. So that's what's held off that process. People don't want to move. They have their farms there. They've been there for generations now, well, about 40 years now. And so they don't want to move, so that's held that process back. So we may not have a dam there. I don't know. But what we may have is gold mining. Because
We provide Guatemala with a lot of gold. We send it to Guatemala by way of the Chicabo. And that alluvial gold goes into the Mopan and it settles into the area, the slight water areas of the Mopan. But I've been told by some Guatemalan officials that the whole of the Mopan has been leased up by gold miners. And they're waiting till the price of gold goes up enough that it's profitable to go out and harvest alluvial gold. And they'll probably do it the cheap way with arsenic. And so you can imagine what happens there. So anyway, that's another reason we really have to go across the border and have serious conversations with Guatemalans and represent our case on the other side. Strategies. And of course, we're talking about adaptation to climate change here. What we really need to do to prepare ourselves for this inevitable thing is about to crash in on us. We're still kind of halfway asleep. We don't really fully appreciate what's about to happen. But right now is when we need to start making preparations. And a lot of the things that we want to do is in line with that. Step number one, people are wanting to know where we put the money. Should we rehabilitate? Well, not yet. The first thing you want to do is to protect what's left. You got to protect what's left. If you protect what's left, you at least preserve some of the ecological services they provide. You're preserving a seed source. So these trees that are remaining there, these riparian trees, they can reseed the riverbanks downstream. And that's also the least expensive strategy. You don't have to spend a whole lot of money. You go to farmers and big landowners and you work out some deals. You may have to figure out some way to reward good behavior. There has to be something going their way, but we can work out some deals because this is in everybody's interest. Then what we need to do is to identify and protect all of our groundwater recharge sites. That's a very important step. For example, there's along the base of the Yalbac Hills, there's this incredible series of cenotes, about maybe 25 or so. I've been snorkeling in a few of those. They are sensational, and every one is a little bit different. They have different ecology, something going on. They need a lot of attention just to figure that one out. But those are groundwater recharge zones. The water coming off the hills, captured right there. It's sitting there long enough for infiltration to happen to recharge the aquifer that's probably keeping the river alive during the dry season. That's what the aquifers do. They provide that base flow that keeps the rivers moving in the dry. Agriculture is already now surrounding possibly two of those. The third one is at risk. And we got to act now. The landowner that has this big chunk, they actually, they have most of these, they actually want to set up some kind of easement. They don't want to farm that area, they want to protect it. And they're doing what they can to kind of discourage farmers, but a lot of these farmers are double farmers or migrant farmers. So they come in, do their thing, raise a few crops and gone. But more and more are showing up. So that's an example we need to really get busy. And many of these are small wetlands, but they still have wetland functions. And you add up all these small wetlands and they contribute a significant amount to the ecology of the watershed. But one of the most important things we need to do is education and outreach. We really have to engage people, particularly the young folks too, and get them involved because those are the future farmers, those are the future environmental managers, the decision makers, and we got to prepare them for that job ahead because that's a serious job. And they've got far more issues to deal with than we do. We're handing them a plate load, and we got to do everything we can to prepare them for that. So anyway, then we want to focus on restoration. We lock up things, we make deals, we try to preserve what's there, and then we start raising money for restoration. And restoration, in some cases, as we cruise the river and survey sites, we're going to realize that, well, this site over here and here and here, these things, all we have to do is take the pressure off, and nature does the rest. Within 5 years, you're going to have a functional system there. Within 10 years, you're going to have a short riparian forest on the making. within 20 years, you're going to have a full riparian forest recovery. That fast in Belize. If you were in the temperate areas, it might take you 20 years to get started. But then there are going to be those areas that require more intervention. Some of these might require tree planting. And one of the things that we want to focus on is urban watersheds. And the reason we want to focus on urban watersheds is because urban watersheds are oftentimes very proximal to schools, and we want to engage students. We're scheming about the idea of maybe having a nursery supply centered at Central Farm UB, maybe, because there's free labor there, and satellite out start out with a couple of different schools who want to join this project, and set up production systems in schoolyards for trees. Get students started growing trees, and then we want to buy those trees from the students and get those students involved in helping to put the trees in their riparian zone. And then those trees are going to require nurturing the first couple of 3 years. And so by the time you grow the seedlings and you plant the seedlings and you nurture the seedling to a good tree size, the people who have done that have developed a relationship with that patch of forest. They're not going to want to see anybody come and chop that down. They're going to want to show their kids that forest. And that's what we want to do. We want to rebuild this relationship with forest, because that's what we do. Then there are going to be those areas like those steep banks. Those are going to require maybe a little soft engineering and a little heavy cash. And we may have to lean on landowners to do that, because it's in their interest to arrest the erosion. But we need to do triage, and we need to do something quick. So that's kind of the strategy we're thinking about right now. I may have gone through some of this. Let me see. Here's another one: increasing the width of riparian strips that are no longer cleared. One of the things that we want to do, like getting cows off the river. That's a good one to talk about. There's a great model. I don't know if anybody's familiar with what went on in New York City about maybe 2 decades ago. They realized that their water plant's not going to provide the service needed for this expanding population. They got to pump about $2 billion into building a new one. And they didn't have $2 billion. So they said, what are the options? And somebody decided, why don't we fix up the watershed? Let's repair the watershed. Let's help revive that watershed. The activities going on in that watershed: corn, beans, and cows. I don't know what's going on here. So they came up with a plan. It cost them about $2 million. They hooked up with all the farmers throughout the watershed that feeds their plant. And they cut deals with the farmers. If the farmers would get the cows and corn off the riverbanks, then they got some incentive. The farmers, the cattle ranchers, if they would put up barbed wire fences, the project would provide the barbed wire fences. But of course, cows need water. And so the barbed wire fences were outfitted with nudge plate water troughs that went right down to the water. The pipe went to the water. So the thirsty cow learns to pump the nudge plate a few times, and then water comes in the trough. They drink, and the smart cows teach the dumb cows, and then everybody's happy. And that's what happened. So the farmers were able to provide for their cows and keep their cows off the riverbank. And the riparian forest came back. And they were able to provide water to New York City. So at a fraction of the cost. We have a lot of problems with sewage. Everybody does. But imagine how many. This is a heaven for bioremediation. We're using plants and microbes to treat waste. And we have quite a few bioremediation engineers right here in Belize looking for projects. And some of these guys are making their living setting up bioremediation systems. A lot of hotels and tourist areas, they love to have that, because a bioremediation system actually greens up your real estate. You can create all kinds of hummingbird and butterfly flower gardens and things off the waste you generate. So you're really using that. Well, you can create crops. I mean, we spend a lot of our paycheck producing fecal material, and you don't want to just throw that away. You want to get some use out of it. So this is one way of doing that. Also, when we start thinking about replanting trees, we're really building that that forest back, one of the things that we can do is get real creative. There's a concept called the working forest, where you plant the kind of trees, especially when you get away from the water's edge, you get a little bit more upslope, you can get real creative and put in kinds of trees that are going to benefit you. If you're a cattle farmer, you can put in trees that are fodder trees. Some of these seed pods and things produced by trees are full of micronutrients that your cows need. You can put in wood trees, or even timber trees, or wildlife fruit trees, or all kinds of things. So the farmer can actually get a little more creative, and actually that gives more ownership. They see a relationship there that feeds into what they're doing. And removing any unnatural structures. People like to build on the riverbank, and sometimes build houses on the riverbank until the flood finally happens that takes it away. But the most important thing here is involving local communities, especially youth. So this is a great way of doing that. And the thing about putting a nursery production system in a schoolyard, once you got that settled, you can start sneaking in agriculture, getting food crops through. Remember in the old days how we used, every school had their little garden? Kids ran home with their radishes and potatoes and different things, and mom sliced them up and made them into the family. We need that again. Kids need to get their hands in the soil, and any way we can do that, we're promoting their survival into the future. So that goes hand in hand. Back to those urban riparian forests. This is an example of an excellent place where you could enlist the aid of kids. But this also shows you another contrast. Here's an urban environment still, but look at that. It's a nice, wide riparian area. This one over here, they got a little carried away with. So there, you can still have full urban environments with riparian forests and all the other ingredients that we need to maintain. And when we get to the water's edge, we got to remember there's that certain assemblage of trees that can tolerate that extremely high energy area, the bree and provision wood and the spiny bamboo and the river fig and all these things that thrive in that environment. That's what makes that work. And you've got to have those trees there that can tolerate that. A bree, it just branches from the base, 4 or 5 trunks, and if you watch the heavy floods, that tree is bending and swaying, but it's not breaking. As soon as that water goes down, it's right there again. We talk about transforming our degraded riparian zone, and here's an example. Several things going on here. Here's some drainages. This is probably a wetland area right here. It looks like another wetland area over there. This is lone spiny bamboo in here. It's got a few little debris or something right in there. This one had a row of trees, so this is not quite as bad, but it's not anything wide enough to really be a riparian forest. So I show this to the farmers, and then I flash on this next slide, and sometimes I kind of hear a gasp, but imagine a transformation here. This is wider than I would expect the final analysis to be, but it's like selling a car. You ask for the high price and you take a lower one, right? So what we got here is, back to this again. What we got here is some negotiation room with farmers. They say, well, that's a little too wide. What if? And then we can begin to dialogue. So, you got to have that way of developing the system. But we've got to do it together. And we've got to get the farmers seriously involved, because this is their livelihood, their future. And they're trying to pass, I talked to the Spanish Lookout Mennonites, they're trying to pass sustainable agriculture to their children. And they realize that they're not sustainable. And they also, another thing that the Spanish Lookout Mennonites are realizing is that they're using far too much pesticide. They're seeing cancer rates. They have a moratorium on using pesticide within the village. But that doesn't mean outside the village. I mean, the rest of us are getting sprayed.
Then they just eat it.
And then they eat it, right. But they're at least gaining consciousness of the situation, and they're trying to make some decisions that'll offset that. So we got some interest there. We got some dialogue potential, and we just need to get that exercised. And there's some very forward-thinking Mennonites within that community, some of which have gone off and gotten bachelor's degrees in agriculture, and they're R&D people. A farmer's a researcher.
Yeah.
you plant seeds here and here and here, and you see what grows, and then, you know, that's how you make your decision. Or what crop is better than this crop, so forth. They have their R&D guy. And a lot of the farmers participate in trial plots of different things. But the problem with the big farmers is that they're ignored. All of the, you know, the extension service and all of that, we focus on the small farmers. And they have their needs. I mean, that's very important. But we do that at the exclusion of the large farmers. So the large farmers are out there trying to figure out what to do on their own. They don't get technical assistance. And we need to be able to talk to farmers and listen to what their problems are. And our job is to help them figure out how to solve those problems, because that's how we eat. And that's a process that we can all begin to engage in, and everybody comes out a winner. So anyway, that's my spiel, and I appreciate you staying here to the last critical minute. Thank you.
Nice, very nice.
Yes.
You're gonna be the smartest guy in Belmont County. He's got to see it all. Your head's gonna explode with all this
I
information.
love it though, nice.
All right, thank you, sir.
Yes,
And
sir.
I
so,
hope you got my good side.
yeah,
Well, I want to ask one question. My sister owned a lot and 37 acres of land in Freetown Lagoon. Her father handed over to her. The big erosion.
Yeah.
And we are very worried because some of the trees are falling into the river. So you were saying what kind of trees we can plant in the river and leave about 65 feet of
Yeah, so at
then you
least.
don't need the cows on the edge of the banks
Right,
either.
right.
And so you were saying, what kind of trees can you plant that the river don't continue to
Well,
break in?
if you're
Because we done breaking about 20 feet already.
if you're talking about right there in the center of town where the community center is,
Right, and
That-
a little bit before you reach there,
From
right,
there?
a house across the river.
oh, okay, that whole bank is caving in.
Right, the whole over
Yeah.
that side too.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that's another one of those steep banks in there, because what's happening, the river's going across this side and it's crossing over on this side. So
Yeah.
you got two cut banks
So
on
that's
top.
the same thing in my sister area also. That is like half a mile up the river.
Yep.
Right? And the river is coming that way, so it's breaking up over that side, and it coming, dashing over her side, and it's breaking that off too.
Yep.
So what kind of tree I need to put there? Bamboo or?
Bamboo would probably be the first thing I would try, because you got to stabilize that. It won't be stable, you got to get it stable enough for the tree to get a root system.
Right.
The bamboo grows fast.
Right.
And you can chop the bamboo up, the spiny bamboo, and just stab it into the.
Okay.
And-
But then she have to leave a good enough area for you have to fence it off.
Yep,
For the
fence it
cows
off.
not to go there.
I would fence it off. What I would do, if it were my property, I'd fence it off, and I would start trying to encourage bamboo to grow along that area.
All right.
And then I would be moving back upslope, and I'd start trees in the
kind of tree?
higher ground. If you're at the water's edge,
At the
you're
water-
limited. And ultimately, you want those trees there, but it's too early to put those trees there. You still have to stabilize that bank before you can start getting brie and
Like a year?
river fig
The
and things.
is over that side there, but
Yeah.
I
years
see-
maybe?
It might take 3 or 4 years.
Oh,
Yeah.
With
When
the
you put
bamboo.
the-
You want that, if that spiny bamboo can really take root before long. Oh, thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Thanks for letting me use your.
No, yeah, that's
Yeah.
fine. Hey,
Yeah.
I don't want to interrupt
No,
the
it's
flow,
okay.
but I do have a question.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
We want to hear your question, and we want to hear
Okay,
your
good.
question.
But you finished?
Yeah, we
Okay,
finished.
but it would take a few years before the bank stabilized enough that those trees can take root. And
Alright.
probably you're going to get some seeds from upstream already settling in, so you may not really have to think about planting up.
That was fascinating.
But you can move up slope and you can start getting creative with trees that are not in danger of caving in, because you want to fortify that whole slope, the whole range.
Yeah. Well, the land is going this way.
Right.
So the whole of this is breaking.
Yeah.
So I was thinking that if she could get in the bamboo quickly, then it will stop.
That's
You
right.
know, it's
But the other side of that discussion is sometimes those riverbank, those cut bank failures like that are so intense that
it comes from underneath.
Yep. And so you have to start putting in large rock or something to stabilize it, and that gets expensive. Yeah, but you might be able, if you can get the spiny bamboo to start clinging on, that's the way to start.
So I will tell her
Yeah.
that.
And you really want to work in the, as soon as the,
For the next year or so, it
Yeah.
will still be breaking until the bamboo gets.
yeah, as soon as the floods are gone, you want to start thinking about getting that bamboo in there, and you want to give it enough time to get some root before the next flood season.
Right.
Yeah, and plant it thick. Some of it's going to die, some of it's going to take. Plant it thick because you want it to
All
be
right.
thick anyway.
That's basically my same question.